So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. My name is Sabina Devan. I'm the founder and executive director of the Just Jobs Network. We are a research organization that focuses on issues related to employment. We work to address what we believe are some of the most pressing questions of our time. Things like, how do we preserve the value of work? How do we create more and better quality jobs? And how do we secure livelihoods and workers in these times of change? To this end, I want to thank all of our participants for joining wherever in the world you are, and to all of our panelists who are also joining from various parts of the globe. We're really grateful to have you all with us in launching this new webinar series that we're calling Reimagining Social Protection. This series is being organized under two of the Just Jobs Network initiatives. One is the Future Works Collective, and the Future Works Collective is a global consortium of researchers that look at the future of work and changing nature of labor markets in these times of tumult. This is a global network that is funded by the International Development Research Center. And this series is also being organized under our Center for Gender Analysis. More information is available on both of these initiatives on our website. So let me just lay a little bit of the context for the conversation today. Our world, our countries, our economies are in some ways at a very critical juncture. The confluence of several forces, so technological advancement, trade shocks, climate change and the energy transition, demographic shifts in the global south. This demographic shifts mean very large and growing youth populations and a brief window of opportunity when there's a larger share of the working age population over the dependent population. This kind of demographic opportunity. All of these big changes are, really upending the way that we live and work. And all of these changes are happening at an unprecedented scale and with great speed. Many look at the impact of each of these forces on labor markets in very individual terms and kind of siloed ways. So we look at the impact of, let's say, AI on labor markets, or we look at the impact of the energy transition on labor markets. But the fact of the matter is that these seismic disruptions are acting on labor markets jointly. And what is, seismic disruptions are taking place because of the confluence of all of these forces. We now see that our labor markets are becoming, more and more precarious. There's a rise in inequality and informal employment. Nearly 2 billion people worldwide are in informal employment. And now more than ever, we need social protection systems. So what do we mean by social protection systems? These are policies and programs that are designed to help workers manage and adapt in the face of risks, such as unemployment, but also things like underemployment, growing informality, inequality, sickness, disability, old age, all of these different sort of manifestations of this era of change that we live in, right? And perhaps we can also expand the definition of social protection a little bit more to go beyond just mechanisms of social security, to also include necessary reforms such as skill architectures and other labor, active labor market policies that are really critical in helping workers adjust in these times of change. Workers in the course of their lifetime now will be expected to change occupations, change jobs, change sectors, learn new tasks, perhaps 2, 3, 4 times, who knows? And against this constant change, we need structures of stability in our social protection systems. These are also automatic stabilizers that smooth consumption. But unfortunately, this need and this great political, economic, and social imperative comes at a time when many governments are very fiscally restrained. We know that the challenge is great. According to the ILO's World Social Protection Report in 2024, almost 4 billion people in the world remained uncovered. And existing social protection systems, where they do exist, are rooted in outdated male breadwinner assumptions that systematically exclude women and other gender minorities. Globally, nearly 2 billion women and girls lack access to any form of social protection. So again, these challenges are great. Perhaps one could say that there's never been a greater need for these systems than today, where there's change at unprecedented speed and scale. But we are also seeing countries confronting fiscal deficits, and many of the developing countries are also confronting very grave debt crises. So against this backdrop, the question that we're here to discuss today is whether there is political will and capacity to provide effective social protection in these times of change when it is drastically needed. And what happens if countries don't rise to the challenge? So this is kind of the broad question that we're exploring today. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our three esteemed panelists for today. Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is the research advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute. He's a fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia, an emeritus professor at the University of Malaya, and also former UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. We've got Dr. Gerry Rodgers, who is a visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development. He was also the former director of the ILO's Institute for Labor Studies, and he brings decades of comparative research on informality, labor institutions, and social protection, including his recent work on Brazil, which he will share with us today. Finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Dalal Moosa, who's a senior economist with the World Bank's Social Protection and Labor Global Practice, where she focuses on issues related to informality, economic inclusion, and building adaptive protection systems across the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asian regions. Just to let all of our participants know that this conversation is being recorded, and we request our participants to please keep your line muted and post any questions in the chat. At the end of our presentations, we'd be very happy to take some of your questions and post them to our panelists. So Jomo, if I could start with you, your work highlights how contractionary global economic policies, climate disruption, fiscal austerity, how all of these are deepening stagnation and worsening inequality. Many developing countries in particular are being pushed to do so much more with so much less. And in this context, we would love to hear your views and see your presentation on what political and policy shifts are needed to make and construct effective social protection systems and to make social protection possible. So Jomo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and it's a real pleasure to join you. And I wish you and Just Jobs Network all the very best in these difficult times as we try to bring some relief in what is increasingly a very hostile world. I also appreciate the efforts of Dr. Shipra Nigam, who made my participation possible, and I'm glad to see some old and new friends on this call. I wonder whether the PowerPoint is up. We are living, I would like to start with Dickens and say that we're living in the worst of times and the best of times. But unfortunately, we are living in the worst of times. I cannot see very much of a silver lining to many of the clouds which we face in the world today. And this, I think, poses very huge challenges for all of us. And I think, and but particularly for the work which you envisage, and you and many of the others who are listening in envisage in these times. Now, allow me to emphasize that um, in the few minutes I have, allow me to emphasize that we have had over almost 2 decades of very lackluster growth, even by normal standards. Since the global financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession, which followed, we have seen a whole range of domestic as well as international policies which have been contractionary, which have been regressive, and this has had worldwide impacts. There have, of course, been contrarian developments, particularly in Asia, both in China as well as in India. But in much of the rest of the world, we have seen very, very lackluster growth. Also, very importantly, we have seen the situation compounded by a whole number of other developments. More recently, we have seen the threat, increasing threat of US-led stagflation. For those who do not know the name, the word, stagflation is a term which was coined in the 1970s to refer to a combination of economic stagnation as well as inflation, something which was not appreciated or anticipated by many of the early Keynesians. Now, if we look at the situation, what we have seen is that the U.S. Fed policies, interest rate increases, have resulted in even slower growth, and because of the response of many other countries. When the U.S. Interest rate hike when interest rates went up, we have seen a tremendous outflow of funds from developing countries, in fact, from some of the poorest developing countries. And this has been acknowledged by not only by the IMF, but Financial Times, and so on and so forth. We have also seen continuing pressure on developing countries to practice fiscal austerity. And the fact that many of these countries are already in debt does not allow them much space. So you need tremendous boldness of national policy if one wants to buck the trend and adopt policies which continue to provide government spending. Yet another major problem, of course, is that we have seen for over a decade now most commodity prices being rather low, with very little signs of improving, except for a few so-called rare earths and other minerals required by some of the new technologies. And then, of course, we have seen a number of other developments. Um, and here, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the specific role of US policies. And we are all quite aware of the changing US geopolitical view. We have seen the trade war and how this has contributed to a huge amount of supply disruptions. We also see less, not more, market access, reversing the neoliberal promise in very important ways. And this is particularly difficult for many developing countries which had already opened their economies under pressure from the Bretton Woods institutions and others, and now they find themselves in a situation where their economies are open, but they are constrained from exporting by a number of measures, including the US measures. But it also is important for us to recognize how, for example, something like CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism introduced by the Europeans, also has a very strong protectionist effect. Then, of course, we've seen, not affecting most developing countries, the intensification of technology war. And we have also seen how climate has increasingly contributed to many of these problems. And what some people would like, the new geopolitics is sometimes referred to as contributing to a second Cold War. In other words, we have a whole range of factors which have contributed to supply side disruptions. Uh, just in case the slide should be now on the fourth slide, Trump 2.0. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on Trump is because his policies will be largely with us for the next 3.5 years, and they have already wreaked havoc, as we all know. But to some extent, he continues policies which were already in place. The protectionist policies have continued for quite a long time of the U.S. But at the same time, the desire of Trump 1.0, as well as other presidents to have a strong dollar, has also been recently reversed by a number of policies. So you have a certain schizophrenia on the part of the U.S. policymakers as far as having a strong dollar or a weak dollar in order to improve exports and so on and so forth. We have also seen policies which seem to be to hurt the U.S. itself by, for example, the reduction of access to SWIFT facilities and so on. So all this and the penalization of those countries who have chosen to join BRICS, even a longtime ally of the Trump 1.0 administration, India, has recently experienced imposition of much more hostile economic policies. Now, this part and parcel of a more general trend of the weaponization of economic policies, the weaponization of economic rules which already exist, and the ignoring other rules which are no longer convenient to the West. And I want to emphasize that while Trump's offense is all the more obvious to us because it is so blatant, and he trumpets and he talks about things which were previously only talked about in hushed tones. What we now find is a situation where it is all quite direct and affects us in very direct ways. And it's also important to recognize the kind of European protectionism which exists in various different forms. And I don't have time to elaborate on all that. But I want to also emphasize the fact that the emphasis on military spending is another factor which will take away from other types of spending, and this will have important consequences, for example, for social protection. And speaking of protection, we now have a situation where it is the US in various different ways trying to extort protection money from the rest of the world. One example is the proposal of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Miran, to sell century bonds, to require U.S. allies to buy so-called century bonds. In other words, U.S. Treasury bonds which will expire only after a century. And this basically means that the rest of the world is expected to bear the cost of inflation. We also see that many longtime U.S. allies, the European Union and Japan, are also being penalized for one reason or other. And this is very important for us to recognize that while the developing countries are facing the brunt of many of these measures, in fact, it is a unilateral struggle on the part of the U.S. to assert itself. So what we find is that countries are beginning to realize that the world is changing in very, very profound ways, and we need to begin to rethink whom we can talk to, whom we can ally with, and there are now possibilities of allying with a whole range of countries, including European countries, including Japan and other countries which might not have been sympathetic in the past, but which may now recognize the need to find new friends, to form new alliances, and so on. This was, for example, very in East Asia. There is an alliance called the ASEAN Plus 3, which is only formalized in the form of something called the RCEP. But it was very interesting because of the inaction on the part of the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries. It was Japan, China, and Korea which got together. And the week before President Trump announced his Liberation Day tariff measures. So in other words, we are seeing countries which were previously not even talking to each other suddenly finding the gumption to get together and think about cooperation in new terms. This is, I think, the most hopeful thing, but we need to be able to recognize how to handle the situation. Now, the next slide reviews very quickly some of the factors deepening the stagnation. But since I'm running out of time, I won't go through all of them, except to emphasize that in a sense, one should, when one talks about all these measures being used as economic weapons, one should not assume that they are only part of economic policy. This is very clear, for example, in the case of the penalization of President Lula of Brazil and Brazil as a nation. And this is solely because of two things. One, Brazil playing a leading role on the question of de-dollarization, which is I want to emphasize, not a BRICS policy. It is South Africa and Brazil which have taken the lead on some of these things, and in fact, the other BRICS, the other original BRICS, are not really behind the whole de-dollarization policy. But the other element is a very personal element. Trump identifies with Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who called, like him, for a coup against the sitting government of Brazil when he lost the election. And it is that which has really become the basis for his current round of tariffs imposed, especially on Brazil. In other words, there are no real rules, there are no real guidelines, and it makes policy making, especially for small countries, extremely difficult. And we need to begin to recognize that the multilateral norms and the rule of law, which has long been touted, doesn't really amount to very much in these difficult times. Just quickly going to the next slide on the distributional consequences of stagnation, it's useful for us to recognize that together with the lackluster growth in the US, I want to emphasize, in the world, in the US, you have continued to have full employment, largely due to the kinds of policies which were undertaken during the Obama administration, continued and elaborated by Trump in his own way, and subsequently pursued by Biden as well. So you've continued to have some degree of economic growth, some degree of employment growth, but the situation in the US, I want to emphasize, is quite exceptional. And of course, I have already mentioned China and India and some other parts of the world. But the point is that you have growth, you have very little growth, let alone job growth in much of the rest of the world. And this poses huge problems. You also have a greater hunger, according to the FAO, since 2014. And you have the World Bank acknowledges that there has been increasing poverty in at least since the pandemic. And all this basically has meant less fiscal space and the possibility of expansion of social protection measures. So what we also find is that the nature of technical change has been labor displacing. So you have increasingly a situation where a great deal of labor is not considered necessary or important for capital, let alone the big capital which the Trump administration has been protective of and promoting. So we have a very, very difficult and hostile environment. And I think the last slide, please, are basically on the prospects for social protection. I think because I'm running out of time, I will not elaborate on this, but I think it's important for us to recognize that many of the lost jobs in the US are not easily recoverable. partly because they have been because of the importance of mechanization and automation and increasing uneven as it is penetration of artificial intelligence in a whole range of technical processes. So what we then have is a situation where Trump's attack on neoliberalism is also reversible, but also partially irreversible. And I think we need to recognize that regardless of what pious neoliberals might say about the state of the world, we are now moving into unknown territory, unenvisaged territory, and we find ourselves in a situation where, for example, even the first managing director of the IMF is calling for the developing countries to align with, not to be aligned in the emerging new Cold War. Then we also have a work which has been emphasized by people like Gerry and others about the tax race to the bottom. And I think it's important to recognize what kinds of policies can be envisaged in this kind of situation. So in other words, we have a very, very difficult situation because the macroeconomic situation is well beyond us. The job situation is well beyond us. And increasingly the norms which are of little interest to the North, especially the US, are being discarded. And we do not find much resistance even among the social democrats in Europe, for instance, of this. So we need to begin to think about how one wants to navigate this situation and work towards what kinds of norms can we advance in this very difficult situation? What kinds of norms are the most important to be protected? And how do we advance social policy, albeit under different names, in order to advance the condition of people, particularly women who are the most vulnerable and in many situations. And also, one should not forget the other victims of this general threat, this general assault on sustainable development more generally. So I do hope that the Just Jobs Network will be able to contribute to this very difficult struggle for our times. And I wish you all well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jomo. We're really grateful for all of these ideas and insights that you've shared. I have to admit that, like I started by saying that these are really unprecedented times because of the geopolitical landscape, but also all of these rapid, these forces that are acting on labor markets and causing disruptions. And the scary part is that both the political will and the capacity of countries for many of the reasons that you have just articulated is very limited right now. And yet, if we go a level deeper and we think about the fact that in this landscape, the ability of workers to adapt, the ability of economies to adapt from one sector to the other, one occupation to the other, to adapt to all of these extremely tumultuous circumstances is really central to the kind of stability we need as a country, as a region, as a globe, in order to to continue on a path of economic growth. Otherwise, it comes tumbling down like a house of cards. And the foundation of this is really ground up. There's a tendency for us to look at it top down, but it is really ground up. And so, Gerry, maybe I'll come to you, and then Jomo, I will definitely come back to you in the end with more questions once we've gone through all of our panelists. But Gerry, I wanted to come to you next. Something that Jomo said really struck me, which is that these crises, in some sense, we've had crises before, and every time we've had protectionist policies. We've had the Latin American economic crisis, the Asian economic crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, then the pandemic. Every single time there is a call for building social protection systems. And there's the world rises and says, we need these institutions in place in order to protect our economies, to smooth consumption, to return back to a path of economic growth, to build resilience, all of these words that people throw around. And then a few years later, we find ourselves with deficient institutions, with deficient expenditures on these very basic foundational needs that countries have. And given your vast experience of years researching inequality and looking at the debates around the importance and the efficacy of different kinds of labor market institutions, and all of your work in Brazil as a reference point, I'm wondering if you could kind of pick up where Jomo left off in really giving us some sense of, given all of these challenges, what is actually possible for us to do, right? What is actually, are we all just doomed and we should just pack up and go home? What is actually within the capacity of countries to do in order to address these grave challenges? Over to you, Gerry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sabina, for the invitation, and to Shipra. And it's nice to be with you, with some old friends, as Jomo said. Even if, as Jomo said, we live in dark times, don't we? And Jomo's the picture that Jomo paints of the world economy just underlines how bleak it is. I'll try and respond a little bit to your challenge, Sabina, because it really is a challenge. And think about in this dark time, are there some lamps shining dimly in the darkness somewhere? I think at the beginning you were very clear about that there's something fundamentally wrong with the social protection systems. There is a traditional system. Actually, it's exemplified by ILO Convention 102 a long time ago, which identifies 9 contingencies which social security systems should cover, and also methods involving social partners in the management of the systems to cover those contingencies. That's a sort of traditional social insurance approach. But that's a convention that's only been ratified by less than 50 countries. And meanwhile, you gave some numbers. The ILO's numbers suggest that only 52% of the world's population is covered by at least one social protection benefit, not even the 9 in the ILO convention. And that's a share which actually is increasing, but it's very slow. And above all, it's incredibly unequally distributed across the world, so that in low-income countries, only 10% of the population is covered by one social security benefit, as against 86% in high-income countries. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's a very telling statistic. And again, using ILO data, only 1/3 of the world's population actually has comprehensive social protection, with, by the way, a big gender gap, 39% for men, 28% for women. So there's a problem of coverage. There's obviously a huge financing gap in developing countries. Closing that gap is totally unachievable, and especially international resource flows completely inadequate, now in decline. Well, the reality was that the international resource flows were always from the south to the north anyway. So there's a fundamental problem in the way social protection systems are working at the global level. I was going to say a word about the global environment, but Jomo has done it much better than I would. I think with the end of hyperglobalization, there is surely a space. One of the standard arguments of the past was social protection is too expensive. We need to be competitive in the global economy. In a neoliberal world, you can't afford to raise your labor costs. That in a if we agree that that world is now on the way out, perhaps we're going to a world which is dominated by other imperial forces, but nevertheless, as Jomo mentioned, the idea of there are regional groupings, there are groupings of countries which can possibly stand up to the new economic imperialism, and that a sort of decoupling may open some space for social policies at the national level. Going to be tough because there's not much evidence that national social policies are actually responding in the right way. On the contrary, there's a tendency for the nationalist capitalist models to have a built-in tendency to concentration as inequality increases within countries. Plus, of course, we have the new types of employment relationships, which are making it more and more difficult to implement and enforce social protection. The millions of piece workers in the global digital economy, in the platform economy. But nevertheless, if there is any hope, it lies in taking advantage of new spaces which might be created in the new global economy. Now, before I'm going to say something about Brazil and how Brazil is responding to this situation, but I think we need also to be a little bit more precise about the term of social protection, because Sabina, you widened it enormously beyond a traditional definition. And it seems to me that, I mean, the issues that you raise are really important, but I think we can focus on the two traditional dimensions of social protection, one being the one that I just described, the traditional social insurance employment-based model, which is closely associated with formal employment, that is insurance against contingencies and life cycle issues. And then there are the very many redistributive programs aimed at income support for low-income or vulnerable groups, which are not necessarily linked to employment status. And many anti-poverty programs fall in that category. And I think it's best to think of those two dimensions as a starting point for social protection. There is, of course, a third protection, because there are many people who are advocating for a wider universal social guarantees, such as citizenship income. I'm not going to talk about that because under present circumstances, I don't believe that's a realistic option. At the moment, it exists only in pilot programs and on a small scale. In an ideal world, we might want to look at that as well. Now, in the developing world, typically, you have an employment-based model, a conventional social insurance model, which reaches a minority of workers, often a very small minority. And alongside that, you have redistributive programs aimed at reducing or eliminating poverty. And India is a classic example, almost archetypal example, with only about 10% of workers in formal employment with adequate social security coverage, while other groups are targeted by a variety of redistributive programs, Narega, food subsidies, some pensions programs, etc. Programs which, despite recent claims to the contrary, leave a substantial proportion of the population in poverty. Now, I'm not going to talk about India, but I think one important point the Indian experience is that this type of piecemeal approach leaves very substantial gaps in social protection, because there is no comprehensive approach. There are bits and pieces which don't make a whole. Let me talk about Brazil. I mean, Brazil is really an interesting model in many respects, and not just because of the fact that it's a particular target of President Trump at the moment. So in reality, Brazil replicates, like India, this model of a protected core of workers, and alongside that protected core, complementary programs. But arguably, it does it in a reasonably systematic way, which isn't universal, not completely, but it does effectively reach a pretty large proportion of the population. And the core of this system is in the labor institutions, and in particular, what in Brazil is known as a carteira assinada, the signed labor card, which, when signed by workers and employers, establishes the rights and responsibilities of both. And if you actually have this signed labor card, you are covered for social security, including retirement, sickness, etc., and even a limited component of unemployment insurance. That's in some sense fairly close to the ILO model. And in the latest data, almost half of workers were covered by this system if you include the public sector. On the other hand, there's 23% of workers in informal wage work without the carteira, and about 30% employees or self-employed. Of the 30%, about 11% contribute to some form of social security. So overall, you've got about 40% of the workforce which lacks these sorts of formal protections. Quite interesting that there isn't a great deal of difference by gender in these numbers. There is a difference by race, with black workers doing significantly worse than white. Now, obviously, this is a system that doesn't work perfectly. There are big differences between regions, but it covers enough of the working population that it's possible to fill the gaps with complementary programs. And the largest is the very well-known Bolsa Familia, which is a conditional income transfer program, which covers 20 million households out of 83 million, covers 1/4 of all households. And it dispersed a little under 2% of GDP in 2024. So for instance, it's much larger than NREGA, which is only around 0.3, 0.4% at the moment. Payments preferentially to women. And there are a number of other programs that are the same. There's another important program, which is My House, My Life, which provides housing finance and also incidentally provides support to the construction sector. And there are a number of other smaller targeted programs. And it's these programs which on the whole pick up the slack with informal workers. But beyond these transfer programs, there's a great deal of targeted intervention which is aimed at improving the social protection of particular groups. For instance, last December, a law was passed concerning care workers, majority of them women, of course. And on that basis, there is a plan to integrate more care workers in social protection systems, find more ways of reaching a larger proportion of care workers which are beyond the scope of existing systems. There's also a special status for self-employed workers, which involves lower social security contributions and lower benefits, but it's a mechanism to bring informal workers into the social security system. And actually, similar policies exist in many other countries, I mean, including in France, by the way. Platform economy is a tougher nut to crack. There was an attempt to introduce a law to regulate this type of employment by giving workers the status of employees. It failed to pass Congress. A lot of political opposition, although there are continuing efforts to build an institutional framework for platform workers. Whether it will succeed is anybody's guess. Actually, that's a key issue in the ILO today. At the moment, there's an attempt to develop a new international standard on the rights and protection of platform workers, one of the crucial issues in the international economy today. It's tough. It's by no means sure that this effort will be successful. There's tremendous opposition from employers and from a number of governments. You can probably guess which governments. So whether that will work, the jury is still out. But there is a systematic effort in Brazil under the current administration. Because while the signed labor card in Brazil dates back to the 1940s, these complementary programs were basically developed in the early 2000s under the first Lula administration, and they were combined with labor market interventions. Labor market interventions to promote formalization where it's possible, ensure that minimum wage is paid, strengthen trade unions, strengthen labor inspection. So there was overall policy coherence. And the result of that was significant redistribution, reduction in poverty, reduction in measured inequality. Interestingly, it was basically a transfer from the middle and upper middle to the relatively poor, to the bottom half. The share in income and wealth of the top 10% in Brazil hardly changed through the period of left-wing governments. And there were clear political reasons for this. Lula, who was an extremely able political operator, he faced considerable opposition to his policies, and he couldn't afford to alienate the richest. And when the government, when the Workers' Party was ousted in 2016, the subsequent Temer and Bolsonaro governments tried to back off from all of it. They tried to flexibilize the labor market. They abandoned Bolsa Familia, sharply cut the benefits, and that was extremely unpopular and is one of the reasons why, one of the reasons for the re-election of Lula in 2022. And he's since rebuilt the Bolsa Familia program. So here you have a system which up to a certain point works, but it's a program which remains very vulnerable. Lula's governing coalition is weak. Brazil remains very unequal. Brazilian employers complain bitterly about the cost of Brazil, by which they refer to taxes and social security contributions. But behind Lula's charisma, Brazil hard to characterize a country, but the Brazilian electorate is clearly right of center. So it's tough for a left-wing government to stay in power. Ensuring this program survives is a constant struggle. But could it nevertheless be implemented anywhere if there is policy space? And in some places there is. Well, Brazil has very powerful labor and social institutions, including the legal framework and the organization of both workers and employers. And the state has shown an ability to raise resources and to allocate them to development goals. And the motto on the Brazilian flag is order and progress. You can say that the key to success in social protection in Brazil has been a coordinated approach which involves supporting, promoting, realizing the rights of workers and extending formalization on one hand, and this substantial redistribution of the program for the population as a whole. But at the same time, taking care not to alienate some of the more powerful interest groups. I think it's important to notice that this works even in an economy which still has a very large informal component. So formalization is an issue, it's part of the strategy, but it's only one element, and it isn't a sort of blind formalization without regard to the way in which the economic system functions. So I think there are lessons for other countries here, but one has also to take into account that Brazil's model of social protection is part of a wider growth regime that has a great deal of autonomy. It's been constructed over a very long period of time, and it has faced considerable political challenges at different periods in the past, not least, of course, the Bolsonaro period. So, I mean, putting these systems of social protection in place, it depends on historical and political context within countries. It also depends, of course, on the global economy. But somehow Brazil has found a space. Can other countries find a similar space? Let us see. But there are some underlying principles and lessons from the Brazilian experience, which I think are of some universal value.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that perspective, Gerry. I think starting where you ended, that there's, Brazil had a very specific historical and political context and space that enabled these and a legacy of strong social institutions that enabled these kinds of social protection policies. And the question remains whether other countries that don't have or may not have a similar context are able to, if not emulate, at least draw some lessons from the Brazilian experience. There's a couple of things I wanted to sort of potentially pose as a question, maybe push back a little, and then I'm going to actually turn to Dalal and come back to you in a little bit with these, but I wanted to just respond to a couple of things. One is, this idea of social security, social protection in the way that you are defining it, in a way that is very fragmented. And let me give you the case of India, where we have this system of state welfare boards that are meant to be institutions that are often tripartite, that are intended to provide social security benefits to workers in a particular sector. So whether that be the construction welfare board, workers in construction, or now the big kind of question that's being explored in several states is trying to form a state welfare board that provides social security benefits, certain social security benefits to gig workers. Right. What we have found in our research in India is that often this kind of fragmented approach to social security provision, even if it's not all 9 benefits, but 1 or 2 or 3 of the benefits that are possible, this kind of fragmented approach often leads to large numbers of workers falling through the cracks, right? And coverage is not actually coverage, it doesn't imply access or availing benefits, right? Which is often the problem we find in India. I mean, India is often touted as a country that has a large share of workers covered under social protection. Is, the statistic you mentioned globally was, I think, 52% is covered by at least one social protection benefit. We have a similarly larger number in India. And yet when you're actually on the ground and you're doing large surveys of workers and even looking at some of the labor force survey data, what emerges is that the access is very limited. There's a fragmented system that leads to several workers falling through the cracks. Not to mention, on top of it all, in a world where an increasing number of workers are self-employed, so 57% of workers of employment in India is self-employment, right? And we know that when Social Security and insurance and protection are voluntary, that workers tend not to subscribe. So there's huge gaps in provision and huge gaps in actually availing and accessing these benefits. And so don't we need to think about universalization, even if it is a very iterative approach? Even if it is a very iterative approach, even if it starts with covering a certain level of workers that are potentially more vulnerable workers and then gradually expanding the net. That's one point. The second is I wanted to use this opportunity to pose the question to maybe all of our panelists on this notion of formalizing the informal. I struggle as a researcher that has spent a better part of 20 years kind of looking at labor markets in the global South and developing countries and kind of looking at what we mean by this idea of formalizing the informal, right? Coverage of under one social security benefit may designate a worker as being formalized, but is it really? And do we need to redefine what we mean in terms, is it even possible in a world where self-employment is increasingly becoming the norm? And there's a lot of more disruptions and dynamism happening in labor markets because of the forces that we've seen acting. So just some responses to you, both Jomo and Gerry, as we're having this conversation. These are the the questions that are emerging for me, and I'd love to potentially come back to them. Dalal, maybe some of these questions also set the conversation up for your presentation. You've talked a lot about moving toward a more inclusive system that requires not just technical fixes, but political vision, sequencing, and communication. And in contexts where fiscal space is tight, and exclusionary legacies run deep, what do you see as the most viable entry points for reform, given the kind of conversation we've been having? Over to you, Dalal.
Thank you. So that would be the last slide in my presentation. But if you will indulge me, I'll spend a few minutes, and I'll time myself as well, just sharing my screen.
Yes, please. And in the meantime, if
do you see the slides?
Yes, we do. We need to go full screen. And
yes,
in the meantime, if any of our participants have questions, please post them in the chat. Just a friendly reminder.
Yeah.
Over to you.
So I'll actually maybe in this presentation, I'll describe or go a bit more micro than what Jomo has mentioned, and maybe a bit more also micro than what Gerry has mentioned. And I'll just go through a few of some of the key statistics and the instruments that are currently being used as social protection instruments in the Middle East and North Africa region. A lot of this is actually based on a report that we published a couple of years ago, which actually provided a good sort of context of aggregating a lot of information about MENA. Because, as you'll know, MENA is a very diverse set of countries, right? It's a hodgepodge of different income levels, significant fragility in some, significant income in others. There are high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And there are definitely those, as you see in red, who are suffering either from current ongoing wars or have consistently suffered from conflict over the past couple of decades. And even when you look at monetary poverty, let alone multidimensional, you see a lot of variability. So in a place like Yemen, it's estimated that the number of people who are actually living below the national poverty line are 74%. That's 3/4 of the population. But then in other countries like Morocco, for example, the official statistics are about 3 or 4% living below the national poverty line. And of course, if you compare it to middle income poverty lines, the numbers increase a little bit. But again, you see that there is large variability. In places like the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, these are the high-income, oil-rich countries where I'm actually residing in one and coming from another. You'll also see generally low poverty levels or monetary poverty levels, but that depends on the population because, for example, it would increase a lot if we look at expatriate workers coming from South Asia, what their income levels are like. The income level of an average Saudi family, for example, is over 3 times higher than the income level of an expatriate worker, let alone an expatriate worker living in really low productivity and low income categories. So I'll present a little bit of a framework because I think this framework, I think, combines, Sabina, what you have, talked about as what is the definition of social protection. And in the original framework, we also expanded a little bit. So in at least in the World Bank social protection global practice, we look at social protection as social assistance, what Gerry has mentioned, social insurance, what also Gerry has mentioned, and that link between the two, which is we consider active labor market programs as part, and economic inclusion programs like the graduation approach as part of that sort of social protection. So we actually call ourselves social protection in labor, but we think of them as all instruments under the social protection sort of broader umbrella. The Middle East and North Africa countries suffer from a number of labor market issues. We have, for example, a significant share of our youth who are not in employment, education, or training, about 32%. It has been persistently high over the past few decades. We have not seen actual change in the past few decades in this share as we have gone through the demographic transition over the years. Comparison, South Asia, for example, is about 23%. We also have generally low, probably the lowest female labor force participation in the world of about 22%, has had some encouraging sort of upward trends in some countries, but overall it remains really low. And by the way, the World Bank regional sort of definitions of the Middle East and North Africa countries, as I've shown you here, are a bunch of them, the typical sort of Arab League countries or most of the Arab League countries, but also recently Pakistan and Afghanistan has been added to the list. So in the statistics that I've shown you and the sort of the analysis that I'll show you, we won't focus on Pakistan and Afghanistan because that was a bit, we still need to update the data for that. But in general, you will see actually worsening labor market outcomes if we include these additional two countries. And as the rest of the world, despite actually large public sector employment historically coming from the 60s and the 70s post sort of independence, there is still considerable informality, and it ranges from generally maybe lower in some countries to generally higher in a lot of other countries. So, for example, Tunisia has about 50% informality rate of workers defined as lacking social insurance, particularly pensions. To Jordan being about 52%, Egypt about 68%, Morocco about 74%. And much higher if we only look at the private sector, because again, a lot of these countries have historically had large public sector employment, which is formal by definition. So if we just look at how maybe social protection can play a role across the labor market engagement or the outcome of labor market, or let's say potentially maybe income in general, and knowing that actually most people around the world derive their income from labor activities. Maybe if we look at sort of a stylized mapping of what that looks like, we thought of, okay, if we look at the sort of the spectrum of people earning income regardless of the source, but mostly, of course, from labor, we could think of non-working poor as the people who are potentially the most vulnerable. This is what you see on sort of the x-axis. These are potentially, for example, let's say households with elderly people who are not able to work. These are potentially people who have, or households or female-headed households, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa region, who also cannot and do not engage in the labor market. Those could be, or we could look at them as potentially the most vulnerable, right? And then it goes as you start work. Informal people, for example, or people who work informally can be poor. And that's the sort of the stylized facts, is that, informal work can generally be poor, but it also can be vulnerable. And sometimes informal work doesn't necessarily mean vulnerability or poverty. In fact, it can overlap, right, with formal wage. So the people who are at the sort of the left end of the spectrum, you would target in terms of social protection instruments, income support. These are the cash transfer programs, potentially some subsidies, etc. And then you would also, as people move up the welfare sort of distribution spectrum, you would target them with a bit more, or you'd provide them with more economic inclusion support, like the graduation approach, active labor market programs. And as they climb up that, let's say work sort of ladder, you would obviously have mandatory social insurance, which is the sort of what we've seen in many countries, but also potentially provide some flexibility through voluntary savings schemes, or these top-ups on top of mandatory social insurance, or sometimes separate from mandatory social insurance. So this is the sort of, I'll go through in the next few slides on what we can learn, or what MENA has done in the past few decades on each of these four instruments. And I'd have to say maybe the largest set of initiatives, potentially the most successful of the initiatives, have been to improve income support, and particularly through cash transfer programs. And the World Bank has been working a lot with these MENA countries over the past couple of decades on building social registries, actually inspired quite a bit by the Brazil approach and Bolsa Familia. And so, for example, Jordan today has a national unified registry that includes about 55% of the population. And then based on those registries, that includes people who are definitely or hopefully at the lower end of the income distribution. These registries build proxy means tests or hybrid means testing to target the people who are considered poor, and then target cash transfers, the income support to them. So for example, in Jordan, they have a unified cash transfer program that is built on a verified social registry that covers about 16% of households in the country, and 50% of those recipients unintentionally actually are women. Which is actually great, because a lot of women, as I mentioned, in the Middle East are definitely without the income support that comes, or the income that comes from labor. Morocco has also actually been quite inspired by Adhar. So the first issue of building a unified social registry in Morocco was that there was no unique identification for people. So the first thing that the government built before it even built the social registry was to actually come on a visit to Adhar and then create the biometric identification system that they did now. And so the RSU now in Morocco actually covers also half of the population, and it was based on this breadth of people in the social registry that they launched the family allowance program, which is also a proxy means test formula that covers now about 40% of the population. And then last but not least, Egypt has also been working really hard on a unified national registry. Theoretically, it includes the information of about 70% or so of households, because it has actually absorbed the food subsidy information, which is almost universal in Egypt. And then on top of this national registry, they've used it to build the Takaful and Karama program, which is a cash transfer program that is now provided to about 30% of Egypt's households and is delivered exclusively for women. So even if the woman is not is the main sort of breadwinner, is not the head of the household, it doesn't matter. They have to identify the woman. And that, I think, is also inspired quite a bit by Brazil. And this was actually a great sort of reform because we've seen a lot of resistance in a lot of other countries in the Middle East and North Africa region of making sure that the cash transfer beneficiary is the woman. And Egypt has kind of broken the barriers on this. And so kudos for them. Karama is actually another program that targets the elderly and is specifically for elderly people. So it tried to make sure that some of the marginalized groups are explicitly targeted in these programs. So, but at the same time, and I think income support programs, particularly cash transfer programs, have in the Middle East and North Africa region been rejuvenated by the pandemic, because they realized at some point in the pandemic that they don't have even the database to cover, to understand who the potential, let alone real, people who have been impacted by the pandemic. So there was a rejuvenation for the social registries. There were massive outreach campaigns to try to add more people to it, make sure that a lot of the population is covered so that at least some could be reached through various programs. And so also in most of these countries, on top of the general cash transfer programs that I've mentioned, there were temporary programs that were explicitly targeting informal workers during the pandemic. I can't talk much about adequacy of these cash transfers themselves in terms of their percentage of household consumption, but at the time, at least in the pandemic, but in general, the adequacy of the programs that I've mentioned are not negligible. They're somewhere between 8 and 10%, I believe. At the same time, there are several challenges that remain, right? And one of the key challenges is exclusion errors. So despite a generally good, in my view, attempt to reach as many people as possible to include in the registry and to target them with cash transfer programs, there are still quite a few people who are excluded from the programs for various reasons. Some of them are far away, for example, in countries like Morocco, where you have quite a bit of a rural population, like Egypt. And then some of them are definitional, for example, definitional. So for example, refugees in Jordan, in Egypt and Iraq rely on humanitarian support. They're not included in the cash transfer programs. Expatriates and domestic workers in the Gulf Cooperation Council cannot access these programs, and they don't even have an enforceable minimum wage, in my view. So this income support doesn't reach everybody. At the same time, there's quite a bit of continuous conflict and volatility that makes continuing sort of the delivery of these cash transfers very sort of sporadic. And then registries, despite our best attempt, are not dynamic. So people have to kind of wait for a year before they can sort of their situation is reassessed. So for people who are in and out of poverty quite frequently, and this could maybe fall one of the categories of people where this could be an issue is digital workers, for example, or when we see economic crises. These registries are not dynamic such that we would be able to know who is getting in and out of poverty frequently to be able to support them. And then one of the key issues of the social protection, particularly the social assistance part of MENA, is that it relies on heavy energy and food subsidies as opposed to targeted cash assistance, for example. So, and these food and energy subsidies reach everybody. Energy subsidies especially are actually regressive, where we know the richest quintiles are the ones who are benefiting the most from it. And then other types of support of social assistance that we know of, for example, social pensions, unemployment assistance, are practically inexistent in MENA. And then sort of now moving as people move towards that sort of, as people work, but perhaps they're not getting enough money from their jobs, as most of the poor are, or most of the poor are actually working poor. We notice in MENA, unlike a lot of other countries actually, that economic inclusion programs that focus on the poor and active labor market programs in general are actually quite negligible. So for example, this chart on the left, this is from our latest, the World Bank's latest State of Economic Inclusion report, where it shows that the Middle East and North Africa region has about 7% of all economic inclusion programs that focus on creating livelihoods for the poor, and a really, really negligible number of beneficiaries, of participants. Whereas, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa has a big share in terms of the number of programs and the number of participants, and most of these big programs are actually run by governments. So in the spirit of what perhaps Jomo has mentioned of the Global South, learning from the Global South and finding alliances and learning from each other, I think this is particularly one area where social protection can learn from the countries of the Global South, especially in terms of economic inclusion programs. And likely active labor market programs, unfortunately, in the Middle East and North Africa region, it's all about, and a little bit like South Asia, and particularly India, it's about job search assistance and job placement and creating those big databases that we don't know who's using them, how updated are the vacancies, are we really targeting the people who actually need this type of counseling and support. And unfortunately, this hasn't changed over the years. And quite frankly, it's this is one of the areas that the Middle East and North Africa region should improve, because it has seen also a really increase in its human capital accumulation over the years. So we know there are many youth who are better educated than their fathers and their grandfathers or their mothers and grandmothers, but are not, for some reasons that we know, some of them we don't know, are not actually finding the jobs that they need. And sometimes it's just about market frictions. Other times it's about more structural issues, of course. And just to maybe close it up on the economic inclusion part, there has been attempts by some Middle East and North Africa countries to attempt these graduation approach type of programs, particularly Egypt, Djibouti, for example, but actually they're very small scale. They rely heavily on NGOs in conception and implementation, and they suffer from really limited financial sustainability. So this is an area where I think the Middle East can also learn quite a bit from South Asian countries, the BRAC approach, for example, in Bangladesh, but also what we know is the NRLM, for example, in India, could be a good option. In terms of ALMPs, just to note what some countries have done, Saudi Arabia, because it's a higher income country, it can afford to spend on a lot of active labor market programs. It has really tried over the past decade through a labor market strategy to enhance various active labor market programs. That includes a program for Saudis for on-the-job training, subsidies, a program to support counseling and skills training and entrepreneurship support, particularly for poor households. They've also kind of modified some of the laws to formalize part-time employment. And they've also done quite a bit for women's labor force participation through subsidized transportation for working women, and then subsidized childcare as well working women. So active labor market programs as part of a larger social protection umbrella could also do quite a bit for women in the labor force. And that ultimately increases their labor force participation, but also increases their chances of being social insurance beneficiaries if they accumulate enough in the future, right? So when it comes to social insurance in the Middle East and North Africa region, most of the countries in the region actually provide some form of social insurance that includes pension, except for 2 countries. The 2 countries are actually Lebanon and Palestinian territories. They have work injury, they have various other types of social insurance that Gerry has mentioned, but not particularly pensions. But most of the Middle East and North Africa countries offer pensions. A lot of it is actually for, of course, public sector workers. And as I've mentioned, the private sector doesn't really use it as much as I've mentioned, high informality. But even when we look at, and it's not just about a person who has contributed at some point in their lives or has been formal at some point in their lives. What is one of the key issues of social insurance in the MENA region is that there are a lot of inactive contributors. So even if somebody has contributed at some point in their lives, they will look like they have contributed, but not necessarily be completely eligible for some of the beneficiaries in some of the benefits in the future, which I think is one of the key issues that that social insurance schemes in the region, but also elsewhere need to think about. And so it ranges, for example, in Malta, which is actually part of the MENA region, and don't ask me why, it's 99% of contributors are active, 99% are active contributors as part of the labor force. But in Iran, for example, or let's say in Iraq, only 31% of the labor force are active contributors to the social pension scheme. And the other very important, I think, issue of social insurance in the Middle East and North Africa region is that it is actually defined, it's defined benefits and not defined contribution based, which means that a lot of these pensions today and a lot of the systems today have an actuarial deficit and are ultimately financially unsustainable. This is fine for the period where there was a demographic boom, but this period is closing for the Middle East and North Africa region, and that's why we need to rethink about these deficits and ultimately who will finance the deficits. It will come out of government budgets. And this is just a chart that shows you how generous the pension system is compared to contributions. If we assume a retirement age of 55 years old, which, by the way, is the average retirement age of people in the Middle East and North Africa countries, which is a very low and young age, in my view, especially as people age, as life expectancy increases, in the region included. And then there are separate pension schemes with higher generosity for the public sector workers. So it really creates a disincentive for people to go into the private sector. And I think, as you mentioned, Sabina, this issue of formalization, sort of formalizing informal workers comes back and I've already actually spent 23 minutes, so I need to really wrap this up. Just to say that we know that formalization of informal workers has been a struggle for a lot of countries everywhere around the world. But we are open to innovations in areas of voluntary social protection, for example. So, and there are examples from the global south, actually, of some things that have worked or that are currently being tested. And that includes, for example, Ejoheza in Rwanda. That includes attempts for Colombia that is specifically targeted for informal workers, understands that some of them are precarious, understands that they may not be able to contribute the same amount for the next 20 years of their lives, that allows for flexibility, that allows them to withdraw some of the cash in case they need. And these, for us, I think, is one area and avenue that could also apply to digital workers, especially that they don't have the typical Bismarckian relationship between employer and employee. The last slide here is that what does it mean, for the Middle East and North Africa region? And we, in this report that we've done, we've sort of laid out some of the key paths, or where we think some of the priorities are. And we think that the first and most important priority is to get your foundations right. And that means you build really good social registries, leverage big data and all the tools that you have to really understand who your poor population is and what they actually need. And then you enhance the opportunities for the poor, not only by providing them with one intervention, but using the social registry to complement it with many other interventions, and having that case management approach where a family can or needs multiple interventions at the same time for them to get out of poverty. And then you increase the access of vulnerable informal workers to social insurance, including voluntary savings schemes. Now, this, of course, requires quite a bit of political support. For the MENA region, social protection has been part of the social contract for the past few decades, right? In exchange for relatively limited and varying democratic rights, the governments of the region have promised strong social protection, free housing, free education, free healthcare, free a lot of the other stuff. So when we think about reform in a tight fiscal space, this has to come with a strong vision and strong communication of what this, because it ultimately means a little bit of a change of the social contract. And so if these limited democratic rights continue, then there has to be, and we know that social protection needs to be improved, then how it is improved needs to probably be not only through a better vision on this communication, as I mentioned, but also doing some things that are not necessarily very popular, which means, for example, changing the taxation system towards something more progressive rather than the VAT system, making sure that the wealthy are part of the revenue that comes from taxation, and rethinking about the role of the private sector and how to really improve it for better jobs. And so I'll stop here. Thank you for listening. I'm definitely over. I thought I would take a bit less. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dalal. You know, you've raised a lot of different issues. I think some of I appreciated the laying out where where you started laying out the heterogeneity in labor market status, and that there's a spectrum of coverage. I also appreciated the challenges that you brought up with respect to both the adequacy of the programs in terms of coverage, but also the adequacy or inadequacy of benefits. And it also occurred to me when you were talking about the active labor market policies that, active labor market policies at a time when a lot of developing countries are facing a particularly short demographic window before, the dependency ratio changes, I think active labor market policies become particularly critical at this time because, we need to harness the productive potential of the working age population. But with that, I want to go straight to questions. We will go about 5 minutes over time, if that's okay. I'm going to pose one question, and then I'm going to leave it open to our panelists to respond in 2 to 3 minutes. So this question comes from Anurag Bihar, who is the CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation in India. And his question is that in the absence of political and historical context that Gerry mentioned, and the troubling geopolitical and global economic landscape that Jomo mentioned, what are your top recommendations for South-South cooperation that could help create a more stable environment and opportunities for focusing on social protection? So Jomo, let me first come back to you, and then we'll go to Gerry. 2 to 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yes, Jomo, please continue.
Yes, sorry. I think the major challenge is to learn critically from the experience of the South. Okay, let's take the example Gerry mentioned, Bolsa Familia, which at one point involved 55 million people. Now, it started off with a project with a couple of funds set up by Ruth Cardoso, the late wife of the former president Fernando Henrique. And what Lula's government did was to scale up and to integrate the different programs. And there was a rationale for it, a very, very rich and rationale for doing so. In the case of Mexico, we have seen how AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's government actually abandoned the World Bank's touted Oportunidades program, which had replaced the Progresa program before that. These were touted as the way to go because the bank was not too keen on Lula's Bolsa Familia. But Andres Manuel's government dropped it and replaced it with their own program, which is basically an employment program. Now, the rationale for doing so is quite complex, and I'm sure Gerry knows much better than I do the kinds of considerations going into this. But I think it's very important to recognize that AMLO, as he's known, was probably the only re-electable president at the end of his term. Okay, he is not allowed to by the Mexican Constitution, but he was the only one, and part of the reason is precisely because of his social policy programs, including his abandonment of Progresa and Oportunidades. This, I think, is a very important lesson. We also find that the way China, for example, does social policy is quite different. Or we look at NREGA in India and how India went about doing it and revising it and the kinds of implications thereof. So you find that even right-wing governments may support social policy programs, but they may do so for their own reasons. But nonetheless, it provides a certain space, a certain kind of protection for some of these initiatives. I think we need to have critical analysis of these kinds of programs to recognize how and why they have survived and been sustained by different governments in rather difficult circumstances. And so, how the whole question of social policy reform has been used to get rid of programs which were actually not very terribly useful. For example, the support in Cairo, in Egypt, the previous subsidy of bread. And how it was being abused and so on. My point is a simple one. There's much we can do to learn from one another, but not, and this is where civil society organizations such as Just Jobs Network become extremely important, because much of the mutual learning we have are from organizations such as the bank, I have to say, rather than through the actual experience and critical experience and debates within these our own societies. I was very happy to see Dalal's designation, because I remember a time about a dozen years ago, and Gerry will probably remember this as well, when the bank refused to acknowledge social protection. It preferred to talk about, what was the term? Anyway, they had something else, which was basically basic assumption was that markets were working fine, and that only in the event of severe market failure did you need to have those kinds of programs during emergencies, for example, during the Asian financial crisis and so on. So I think there's a lot to be learned from our past experience, including, for example, the nutrition programs for children in these kinds of things. They are not touted as programs. And the idea that cash transfers or any of these other things are the best way to go about doing so, it has to be really challenged. And this becomes especially important if we are going to think about programs which might be able to mobilize sources rather differently, sources from communities, for example, and which has been the case, for example, for some of the school feeding programs, which have been so important in the poor areas in many parts of the world. Let me stop here because I think I'm exceeding my time.
Thank you so much, Jomo. In the interest of time, Gerry, over to you.
Well, let me just pick up one or two things. Let me come back to your earlier comment, Sabina, and well, you had more than one comment, but you were talking about fragmentation and exclusions, and I think that this was one of the key lessons of the Brazilian experience, and it's something which is worth exploring much more systematically. It can be actually within India, different parts of India, the same sort of issue can be explored. To what extent can you build coherence? To what extent can you build programs which actually tackle the multiple sources of exclusion? Because none of the individual instruments that we've been discussing here is enough on their own. They all capture a part of the story, and I think this is where if we let me say in India, for instance, the emphasis on Narega is fine, but Narega doesn't work on its own. Unless employment programs are actually built as part of a package which deals with different aspects of protection that are needed. Narega doesn't deal with many of those. It's important as an element in a package, and I think that's the Brazilian story, is that you construct a social protection package, not just on the basis of one or two elements, but on the basis of a thorough understanding of the different populations concerned and the diverse needs and issues that they face. And I think that's the way, because I think you asked the question, Sabina, how to universalize. I think that's the way to universalize, not by having a single approach which you attempt to apply universally, but by having multiple approaches by which you attempt to reach the needs of the population as a whole. I think, I mean, like Jomo, I think the issue of South-South cooperation in this field is an issue of knowledge and ideas. That I think you know, the BRICS is an extremely powerful organization in principle. I'm not sure that there's a real exchange of ideas among the countries of the BRICS to the extent that would be needed. I work in both Brazil and India. I don't see a tremendous exchange of ideas between Brazil and India, each going a different path, but there's a tremendous amount of learning which is possible. So I think that South-South cooperation is at that level. It's in terms of research institutions, in terms of ideas, it's in terms of experiences of different types of policies. And it's in terms of the organizations. I mean, I also agree with Jomo. This is not just about governments. This is also about a wide variety of actors, and NGOs, research organizations, trade unions, a variety of actors that can operate across different countries in the South, and thereby build up a capacity to resist the ideas which flow down from the North. Latin America has in the past been more successful in this respect because it has a language barrier. It can keep out the gringos because of the language. That's not the case in much of South and Southeast Asia and much of Africa as well. But that for me is the key issue on South-South cooperation, not actually cooperating on programs, it's cooperating on ideas.
And Dalal, do you have any last comments, perhaps in a minute or two, and then I'll just end we are a bit over time, but.
Yes, apologies for all the other people that actually have asked questions, and we probably wouldn't get to talk to answer some of these questions. But I agree that the tools, in my view, social protection is a tool or a bunch of tools that should be used in different times and with different life cycle issues or life cycle threats and risks. So for example, for young people or children who are suffering from nutrition issues, we need to make sure that income support is not only just income support, but really targets better nutrition outcomes and is complemented with better healthcare and all of that. As people grow, the various risks that they face in life is different. So it's not necessarily income support or a particular tool, but it has to be changing throughout a person's lifestyle, a person's life cycle. And at the same time, the tools may not be perfect for countries in every specific time. So for example, Oportunidades was actually, the cash transfer program that was done there was rigorously tested, very good sort of RCT type of trials, a very good impact on people's consumption, savings, investments, including investments in their children's healthcare and education. But of course, as a country grows and develops, maybe there is less of a need of that as a core social protection instrument, and it has to move more towards the labor market attachment and covering people in their labor market risks. So, and this sort of, and I think that it's not just as somebody mentioned, I think, I'm not sure, maybe it was Gerry, it's an exchange of ideas, an exchange of experiences. And sometimes in the past, we've also focused on East Asia as they are the tigers sort of in economic development. But in my view, Sub-Saharan Africa today offers a lot of great examples of what can actually work in a really difficult environment, fragile, with a lot limited institutional capacity. And we in the World Bank have been working quite a bit on that. Unfortunately, not all of our clients love to hear examples from Sub-Saharan Africa. Because they think they are higher income countries and they're not comparable. And sometimes humanity does think that every single country is unique in its experiences, but we try to say that we're not as unique in our experiences. We do share a lot of common problems. And I think that sharing of experiences is key for the Global South.
Thank you so much. So Jomo, Gerry, Dalal, thank you for a very rich conversation. I echo Dalal in saying that we have a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to, but the advantage is that this is it's a series, and it's a series where we hope that every subsequent conversation builds on the richness of the conversation we've just had. Jomo, Gerry, Dalal, thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time. I could sit here and talk to you each for several hours more. But I think in this conversation, we've done a very good job of both painting the very macro picture, but also going down into the details of certain country experiences. We've aired several challenges that exist, again, from the macro to the very micro, institutional, country, context-specific challenges. I think that moving forward, I think there's a lot of room to go deeper into some of the solutions, go deeper into the nuances of universalization from formalizing the informal, active labor market policies, and several more of the issues that have come up. And I will say that I really appreciate, in some sense, Jomo, you started this, and then I think Gerry and Dalal have perhaps in some ways underscored the challenge to organizations like the Just Jobs Network to be a space for the exchange of knowledge and ideas, and even documenting some of the practices across countries in the Global South, so that there's opportunities for more learning, more sharing, as we confront this very daunting time in human history. So I will end it there. I also want to thank my colleague, Dr. Shipra Nigam. Her name has come up several times. Shipra, I don't know if you want to turn on your camera. And to also my other colleagues at Just Jobs Network that are too many to name, but that have been a very integral part of putting this webinar together. I'm just the face of it. The real work has been done behind the scenes. So thank you all so very much. And we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.